George, let me start with you and just take us through how you assess the threat environment.
So, Nicole, thanks for having me and thanks for this important conversation. I think your segment in the lead up to this question really outlined the appropriate timeline here that we've been seeing as a country unfold, starting with the march in Charlottesville, the chant of Jews will not replace us, to the attacks on the Jewish houses of worship in Pittsburgh and Poway, to other attacks targeting Latino and immigrant communities in El Paso, Texas, and elsewhere across the country. The rise in anti-Semitism has been unmatched and unlike anything we've seen in recent years. The data from ADL shows us that last calendar year, 2021, was the highest year on record of anti-Semitic incidents in the history of the United States since we've been reporting these incidents. And we're not just talking about individual acts. We're talking collectively vandalism, violence, hate, harassment, targeted towards individuals because of where they pray or what they may be perceived to look like. And so the statistics are really telling. And what we have here today is that the events with Kyrie Irving and Kanye West, there's really a mainstreaming of anti-Semitism that's been in the public eye. It's incredibly unfortunate and incredibly disgusting. And this is part of the reason that the ADL respectfully turned down the contribution from Kyrie Irving that he had initially promised to make. He was given ample opportunity to do the right thing, to apologize and condemn anti-Semitism. He failed to do so at almost every step along the way. His suspension, candidly, is well-deserved. His most recent apology is encouraging and a right step. But the key point here, Nicole, is that the education of anti-Semitism that ADL has been in the business in for over 100 years needs to continue and needs to increase 100-fold from what we're doing today.
George, when you look at extremism, what Kyrie Irving did has no excuses, and I think time will tell if he can be redeemed and play basketball. But at a bare minimum, he worked for a team that after a little bit, probably too long, did sanction him. Kanye West has too much influence, and that's another conversation about our celebrity culture. But after too much time, again, many of his sponsors parted way with him. Doug Mastriano is getting money from national Republican organizations. Many Republicans amplified statements that were made by Kanye West. Fox News has mainstream Republicans on their network all the time. No boycott of them. They've platformed Kanye West. What happens in the extremism world and the proliferation of hate when an organization that has the power to sanction anti-Semitic speech or conduct doesn't?
It's incredibly, incredibly hurtful and impactful to Jewish communities across the country. In your segment earlier, Nicole, you mentioned the threats to Jewish communities in New Jersey. In the past 4.5 hours, we've seen threats against a synagogue in Birmingham, Alabama. This is all in the past 24-hour period. And so what we know is the mainstreaming of these ideologies, of these anti-Semitic and insightful ideologies, have real-world law enforcement consequences. Jewish houses of worship and community centers are targeted. Individuals are, in the case of many instances across the country, attacked, and in some instances, God forbid, like another Pittsburgh, killed and murdered. And so there's real-world consequences that, unfortunately, in many instances we've seen are a matter of life and death when these tropes, when these conspiracy theories land in the minds of people that have a preponderance or an inclination to do something with these insidious ideologies.
And George, because it has been your life's work, what do you make of this moment where extremism, which really, I understand it can most effectively be countered from within its own community, when you have on the right, one of the two major political parties in America has done nothing to rein in or push back against extremism. And I asked your colleague, Jonathan Greenblatt, what the conversations are like with Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy when he asked the two most powerful elected Republicans in America to condemn anti-Semitism, and they say no. And he wouldn't share those private conversations, maybe you will, but he said, well, Mitch McConnell won't even condemn racist attacks against his own wife, Elaine Chao, when they come from Donald Trump. What is the impact when leading Republicans won't police their own side?
What I can share with you, Nicole, is that we've been on the forefront engaging across the political spectrum in a bipartisan and nonpartisan way of issues on anti-Semitism for well before the Trump era began, and we will continue to do so. The other thing I can tell you is that your question is in the context of possibly the most polarized political climate that we've been in this country in decades, and certainly not one that I can remember in my professional life. You know, I started working on these issues of combating ideologically motivated extremism in the weeks and months after 9/11. Today, we're talking about it in a domestic nature, and to your question, in a political context. And so the bottom line is more leaders, more public officials need to stand up and speak out forcefully, not just against anti-Semitism, but against any type of hateful or insidious or insightful ideology that we know, in the case of ADL, protecting Jewish communities on a day-to-day basis, which is our business, that can very much be insightful and be detrimental to communities across the country. Today, Nicole, in New Jersey, there will be houses of worship and congregations that don't come together and pray like they do on a weekly basis because of the threats emanating in New Jersey. The same thing is true tonight in Birmingham, Alabama. That is not okay, and that's not a society that we should be okay living in or raising our children in.
But that is who we are right now, at least. Pete Strzok, what does the FBI see when it issues a broad warning about synagogues in New Jersey?
I think the FBI was concerned enough that they put the day before the Sabbath, they put out this warning that was significant enough that they wanted to put everybody on notice that there was this threat of violence. Now, thankfully, they indicated last night and again today that they had identified, at least in New Jersey, an individual who was the source of these threats. They indicated that he had expressed an extreme amount of hate towards the Jewish people. But again, this is something that when you look at it, particularly as a federal law enforcement organization like the FBI, as George indicated, the problem is this is the anti-Semitic vitriol that is present across the board in our nation's dialogue, whether that's coming from politicians, from entertainers, from athletes. This is something that is normalizing and encouraging violence. And it need not be, and in fact, many cases, it isn't coming from any sort of organized group. These are people who probably are not right to begin with, who buy into this sort of just vile rhetoric, and they take it upon themselves because they think it's all right to go out and start making threats and engaging in violence. Now, if you're trying to prevent violence, that's a nearly impossible task. You can see when you look at, kind of discrete organizations who may be putting forward, anti-Semitic tropes or saying things, but when it comes to a recipient, somebody who's listening or watching or reading on social media or seeing what's being said, and they suddenly decide to take matters into their own hands, that's extraordinarily dangerous. And it's also very, very hard to get ahead of something like that and preventing that violence before it occurs.
Pete, does law enforcement have the tools they need to make this pivot that George described, that the work of government counter-extremism experts has been largely directed at the extremism behind al-Qaeda and then ISIS and things that led to a heightened threat environment in the years after 9/11 here and to American institutions around the world? But if Christopher Wray has testified under oath that now a far graver threat to the homeland is from domestic violent extremisms, and, quote, in that bucket, by far the largest group are white nationalists and racists, what do we do about that? Do your former colleagues at the FBI have the tools to protect us?
Well, Nicole, I think they certainly have a huge task in front of them. And the issue is, the FBI cannot influence, political dialogue in this nation. They can encourage a decrease in violent rhetoric, a turn away from anti-Semitism or encouraging violence against others. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at QAnon, who a huge number of people running for office and up for election in just a few days support the tenets and ideas of QAnon, and you go to any conference, if you go to 4chan or Getter or Gab or any of these places and look at what QAnon is putting forth, you see reference after reference after reference to George Soros, to the Rothschilds, all these old, horrible anti-Semitic tropes pointing to the Jewish people as behind the banking system or the one world global order. It is incorporated into the political ideas and dialogue on the part of a huge number of candidates. Now, the FBI can't do anything about that. The FBI can look to those people who are listening to this, who are becoming radicalized by this, but the cause at the end of the day are coming from leaders, again, whether it's in politics, whether it's in entertainment, whether it's in the sporting industry, these are the folks that need to say, this is unacceptable and it has to stop. And I'm worried that we're having a very, very difficult time having anybody getting them to say that.